The world was on fire. Millions were dying in the mud while empires crumbled into smoke. But in a small, silent workshop in America, one man was building something that would change war forever. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a general, he was a mechanic, and his idea would make him immortal. This is the story of John Moses Browning, the man who turned a single spark into a storm of steel. Browning was born in 1,855 inches, Ogden, Utah, the son of a frontier gunsmith. His father, Jonathan, forged rifles for settlers heading west. The boy grew up inside the forge, surrounded by smoke, heat, and the rhythm of the hammer. At 7, he was already shaping metal beside his father, watching how springs stored power, how pressure became motion. At 13, he built his first working rifle from scrap. It fired perfectly. He understood, even then, that a weapon was not an instrument of death, it was a question of physics waiting for an answer. When his father died, 19-year-old John inherited the workshop. He worked late into the night by lamplight, filing, carving, perfecting. In 1879, he patented a single-shot rifle so precise that Winchester bought it on sight. It made him successful, but money was never the goal. He sought perfection through simplicity to remove every unnecessary part until the machine seemed alive. Through the 1,880 seconds, he designed repeating rifles, pump-action shotguns, semi-automatic pistols, each a step towards something greater. He dreamed of a weapon that would fire itself, using its own power to reload and strike again. Most experts called it impossible. To Browning, impossibility was just an invitation. Then, one blistering afternoon in 1890, the answer appeared. He stood alone on a dusty Utah field, testing a rifle. Each shot cracked through the air, and the tall grass bent from the blast of hot gas leaving the barrel. He fired again, and the grass rippled once more. In that instant he froze. The wasted energy that moved the grass could move a machine. That invisible breath could make the gun cycle itself. He raced home, filled his notebook with frantic sketches, and built prototype after prototype. Springs snapped, bolts jammed, barrels burst, but he learned with every failure. Finally, one evening, the weapon roared in a continuous rhythm, smooth, controlled, unstoppable. The world's first gas-operated automatic gun had come to life. In 1891, he presented it to the U.S. Army. Officers watched politely, unimpressed. They called it clever but unnecessary. Machine guns, they said, belonged in fortresses, not in soldiers' hands. Browning packed up his weapon, nodded, and went home in silence. He knew they were wrong. Years later, when the Great War consumed the world, those same generals would beg for his design. From a quiet field where the grass once moved, John Moses Browning had glimpsed the future. He wasn't a soldier or a scholar, just a man who believed that nature wastes nothing, and that every force, even a breath of gas, can be shaped by human hands. That simple idea would arm nations, end empires, and make one quiet mechanic from Utah the most in seconds. When the echoes faded, silence filled the field. Browning waited for applause. It never came. One officer called it a mechanical curiosity. Another said, too complicated, too fast, not practical for war. The demonstration ended with polite handshakes and empty promises. To the army, machine guns were still toys of defense, heavy, fixed, and rare. They could not imagine a battlefield ruled by mobility and speed. But Browning could. He packed his invention and went home quietly, knowing that one day they would understand. Back in Utah, he returned to his workshop, a temple of iron and ideas. The walls were lined with blueprints, tools, and half-finished designs. He worked day and night, chasing perfection the way some men chase faith. Each failure became a stepping stone, each jammed bolt a teacher. He was not discouraged, he was learning the language of pressure and time. He refined his automatic weapon again and again. He adjusted springs, pistons, and levers until every movement flowed like breath itself. The weapon could now fire hundreds of rounds without breaking. It was lighter, smoother, and more reliable than anything else in existence. But no one wanted it. The market was obsessed with tradition. So Browning turned his mind to other creations: the elegant Colt pistols, the repeating shotguns, the legendary 1911 handgun that would one day become the heart of the U.S. military. Yet, deep down, the dream of the automatic weapon never left him. He had seen the future, and he couldn't turn away. Meanwhile, the world beyond his workshop was changing. Empires clashed for colonies, armies grew restless, and technology raced ahead faster than reason. Europe was a storm waiting to break. And when it did, Browning's forgotten invention would find its purpose. By 1914, war engulfed the continent. In the mud of France and Belgium, millions of men faced each other across lines of barbed wire and trenches. They fought for yards, not miles, and the machine gun ruled the battlefield. The German Maxim gun, heavy and water-cooled, could cut down hundreds in minutes. Soldiers advanced only to die in waves of fire. Generals still dreamed of glory, their men drowned in blood. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched in horror. When America finally entered the war in 1917, it discovered a cruel truth: its army was woefully unprepared. There were not enough machine guns, not enough reliable weapons for the millions of men being sent to Europe. Factories worked day and night, but time was slipping away. And then, someone in Washington remembered the quiet inventor from Utah, the man who had once offered a weapon that could change everything. At 62, John Browning was summoned to the Capitol. He brought with him not one design, but two: an improved version of his gas-operated gun and a new, heavier model using the power of recoil itself. When the tests began, the results were astonishing. Browning's weapons fired continuously, flawlessly. They didn't jam. They didn't fail. They simply worked. The officers who once dismissed him now stood in stunned silence. They had found the tool America needed to fight a modern war. Factories were transformed overnight. Automobile plants became armories. Women filled the assembly lines, cutting steel and fitting barrels with precision. Browning supervised everything, redesigning parts, improving tolerances, solving problems faster than the engineers around him. He refused to rest until every gun worked as perfectly as the one that first spoke on that quiet Utah field. It was no longer an invention. It was a promise, a machine built to protect those who carried it. In the roar of industry, John Browning's vision had finally found its moment. The spark that once moved a blade of grass was now moving nations. From failure to faith, from ridicule to revolution, he had proven one truth that would define his life. Real genius is not the power to invent once it is the courage to perfect forever, hardened by years of trench warfare. But they were marching into a nightmare. The Germans had mastered the machine gun. Their Maxims guarded every hill, every trench, every road. The ground itself seemed alive with bullets. To survive, the Americans needed a miracle, something stronger, simpler, more reliable than anything seen before. And that miracle was being built by a 62-year-old mechanic from Utah. Inside the roaring factories of Connecticut and Massachusetts, Browning supervised production like a man possessed. He moved from machine to machine, adjusting tolerances, rewriting instructions, solving problems in minutes that baffled engineers for days. When a part broke, he redesigned it overnight. When workers struggled, he simplified their tools. He didn't just build guns, he built a system of perfection. To him, every piece of metal was a soldier, and every weapon was a life depending on him. By the summer of 1918, crates stamped with Browning left American ports bound for France. Inside were two creations destined to change the course of battle: the M1917 heavy machine gun, cooled by water and capable of endless fire, and the Browning automatic rifle, a lighter weapon that a single man could carry. They were unlike anything the trenches had seen. Strong, reliable, relentless. When the first Browning guns reached the front, soldiers gathered around them like pilgrims before a sacred relic. They were told the weapon could fire hundreds of rounds without jamming. No one quite believed it until they pulled the trigger. The roar was steady, deep, and endless. Shells flew like sparks. Mud splashed. The barrels glowed red, but the rhythm never broke. At last, the machine fought for the man, not against him. In the chaos of the German spring offensive, Browning's designs proved themselves beyond question. At Belleau Wood, American Marines fired the M-1000-917 until the enemy lines dissolved into smoke. At Saint-Mihiel, soldiers advanced behind the BAR, its rhythmic bursts cutting through the fog. In one battle, a Browning gun fired over 20,000 rounds in a single day without a single failure. Mud, rain, or blood could not stop it. For the first time in history, men carried automatic firepower into motion. War had changed forever. To the soldiers, it felt like holding lightning. They trusted these guns like brothers. When asked what he thought of Browning's weapon, one American sergeant simply said, "It works when God doesn't." That was all the praise John Browning ever needed. Back home, the newspapers called him the man who armed America. Factories ran day and night under his blueprints. Women workers, their hands black with oil, assembled each gun as if it were a living thing. Every barrel, every bolt, carried his silent obsession never fail. And they didn't. The Browning name had become a symbol of reliability, precision, and the quiet power of American ingenuity. When the guns finally fell silent on the 11th of November 1918 and the armistice was signed, Browning's weapons rested across the world's most brutal battlefields. They had turned the tide of war. But for John, victory was not triumph, it was reflection. He had built the tools of survival, but they had taken countless lives. He never celebrated. He returned to his workshop, the same small room in Utah where it all began, and sat alone at his bench. There, surrounded by sketches and steel, he whispered a prayer not for glory, but for understanding. He believed invention was never about destruction, it was about mastery of nature's forces. Humanity decided how those forces were used. He could not change that, but he could make sure that what he built worked perfectly because in imperfection, men died. The world called him a genius. He called himself a mechanic. Yet his mechanic's mind had reshaped the 20th century. And though the war had ended, the age of Browning had only just begun. Browning. While soldiers fought in the trenches, Browning fought in the factories. He was 62, grey, exhausted, but relentless. America had entered the war too late, and its soldiers were marching into battle without enough guns. Factories were empty, blueprints unfinished, time already gone. But Browning refused to let defeat write the story. He would build faster, simpler, smarter. He would race against time itself. In the roaring heart of American industry, sparks flew like stars. The Colt and Winchester factories became battlefields of another kind where fire met steel and every mistake cost lives. Browning walked among the machines with oil-stained hands and a pencil behind his ear. He barely slept. He lived on black coffee and determination. To him, every weapon was more than a machine. It was a promise to a soldier he would never meet. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. Every perfect part, he told the workers, is a man who comes home alive. That sentence spread through the assembly lines like prayer. Men and women worked through the nights, guided by his sketches pinned to the walls. He corrected designs on the factory floor, sometimes drawing blueprints directly on steel plates when paper ran out. No failure escaped his attention. If a gun jammed, he redesigned the bolt. If production slowed, he reshaped the part to fit easier. The M-1000-917 heavy machine gun rolled from the lines, first water-cooled, solid, unstoppable. It could fire for hours without faltering. Then came its lighter brother, the Browning automatic rifle, the BAR, a weapon one man could carry into battle. For the first time, soldiers could move with automatic fire in their hands. Browning's two creations became the beating heart of the American army. He was an artist sculpting with fire, adjusting tools, training mechanics, solving problems before anyone else saw them. He worked 18-hour days without complaint. When someone begged him to rest, he only smiled and said, "There's no rest when men are dying." By mid-1918, crates stamped U.S. Browning began their journey across the ocean. Inside were the weapons that would decide the war. On the fields of France, soldiers unboxed the new machine guns and stared in awe. The metal felt alive, smooth, balanced, trustworthy. When the first shots rang out, the guns spoke with a steady, deep rhythm. No jams, no failures, only power. Reports spread fast. Browning's guns could fire 20,000 rounds in a single day and still keep fighting. They worked in mud, rain, and dust where others failed. American troops began to believe that the old mechanic from Utah had built something divine. To them, the Browning gun was more than a weapon, it was survival made of steel. Back home, newspapers called it the miracle of 1918. Factories celebrated Browning as the man who armed a nation in months. But he didn't celebrate. He simply returned to his workbench, hands blackened, eyes red, quietly polishing another barrel. He wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing perfection. When the armistice finally came that November, the world exhaled. The war had ended, but the legend of Browning had just begun. He had proven that brilliance wasn't born in universities or laboratories. It lived in workshops, in sweat, in sleepless nights. He had turned the chaos of war into an orchestra of precision, and his music was the sound of survival. 1918 ended with silence across the battlefields of Europe. But in the heart of America, John Browning's forges still burned. The race against time was over, and he had won, answered with a new sound, a deep, steady roar that rolled across the battlefield like thunder. The world was hearing the voice of John Moses Browning. The M1917 machine gun and the Browning automatic rifle, the BAR, had arrived. Their journey from the factory floors of America to the killing fields of Europe had taken only months, but their impact was immediate and devastating. Soldiers who had once fought with bolt-action rifles now held the power of continuous fire in their hands. The enemy's confidence began to crack. The Browning guns didn't jam, didn't stall, didn't fail. They simply worked. At Belleau Wood, U.S., Marines dragged the new M1917S through mud so deep it swallowed their boots. They set them up on the ridge and opened fire. The gun's rhythm was like a heartbeat, controlled, unstoppable. Within minutes, entire enemy waves vanished in smoke. The machine never faltered. A single weapon, built in a small Utah workshop, now protected thousands of lives an ocean away. In Saint-Mihiel, the BAR made its debut. Light enough to carry, deadly enough to dominate, it gave infantrymen a power they had never known. Soldiers could advance under their own cover, laying down bursts of automatic fire while moving forward. It was a new kind of warfare, fast, flexible, terrifyingly effective. One sergeant wrote in his journal, "The BAR fires like anger itself." Another said simply, "It doesn't stop until you tell it to." The German troops quickly realized they were facing something different. Their Maxim guns, once unmatched, were too heavy, too slow. Captured reports described new American weapons of exceptional strength. In one engagement, a Browning gun fired over 20,000 rounds in a single day, only pausing to replace a glowing barrel. In another, a weapon buried by artillery was dug out, wiped off, and fired again without a single malfunction. For soldiers living minute to minute, reliability wasn't convenience, it was survival. Every trigger pull was a silent thank you to the man who had built it. Browning never stood on a battlefield, but his spirit was there in every precise click, in every burst of fire that kept a soldier alive. He hadn't built his guns for glory. He had built them to endure the impossible. By the autumn of 1918, the Allies were pushing forward. In the massive Meuse-Argonne offensive, Thousands of Browning guns filled the air with a constant rhythm of fire. Commanders called it the mechanical tide. The sound echoed across valleys and forests, a deep, metallic roar announcing the dawn of modern warfare. In the mud and chaos, soldiers carried the BAR like a lifeline. They trusted it more than luck, more than faith. When their world turned to smoke, the gun's voice reminded them they were not powerless. When the armistice came on November 11th, the silence that followed felt unreal. For a moment, there were no orders, no bullets, just wind moving through the empty fields. But scattered across those fields were thousands of Browning weapons, cold, black, and silent, yet undefeated. They had done what they were built to do. They had survived the war, and so had the men who carried them. Back in America, Browning received letters from the front written by soldiers whose lives his machines had saved. One wrote, "Sir, your gun jammed only once when I forgot to breathe." Another simply said, "Thank you for bringing me home." John Moses Browning read those letters in silence. He never replied. He simply placed them in a drawer, wiped his hands clean, and went back to work. For him, victory was never about fame. It was about precision, about doing his duty perfectly. He had seen his designs tested in the harshest place on earth, and they had not failed. Now, he wondered what new perfection might still be waiting beyond the forge. The war was over, but the fire inside Browning was not. He had proven that ideas born in small workshops could shape the fate of nations. The baptism of fire had come and gone, and his creations had emerged immortal. Engineers across the world continued refining his designs, but the truth was simple. They could improve details, not replace his genius. Every bolt, every spring in his creations carried the elegance of a mind that saw order inside chaos. The weapons he left behind, the M1917, the BAR, the Colt 1911, and the new M2 50 caliber machine gun became the foundation of a new century of warfare. By the 1932, the world was once again walking toward disaster. Old wounds from the Great War had never healed. Nations rearmed, factories roared back to life, and the clouds of war darkened the horizon. In arsenals across Europe and America, Browning's weapons were pulled from their crates, cleaned, oiled, and readied. The man was gone, but his inventions were alive and ready. When World War II erupted in 1939, Browning's fingerprints were everywhere. His M2 50 caliber machine gun became the beating heart of Allied firepower. It guarded bombers, tore through enemy aircraft, and crushed armored vehicles. On the beaches of Normandy, in the skies over Berlin, on the islands of the Pacific, its deep, thunderous rhythm echoed like a ghost from the past. The soldiers called it Mardeus, half in fear, half in love. It was heavy, brutal, unstoppable, and utterly reliable. The BAR, carried by infantrymen across Europe and Asia, became a symbol of American firepower. It marched through mud, snow, and jungle, refusing to break. The M1911 pistol, designed decades earlier, was still the soldier's closest companion, simple, powerful, unyielding. Together, Browning's designs armed the free world. He had been gone for years, yet his work was now saving civilization itself. After the war, the legend only grew. The Korean War came, Browning's guns fired again. Then Vietnam, same guns, same reliability. Even in the burning jungles, where rain turned metal to rust and mud swallowed men whole, the M2 kept firing. No one could kill it. Soldiers began calling it the immortal gun. By the 1992, new materials, electronics, and computers had transformed warfare. But still, the same weapon John Browning designed with pencil and intuition, in the 1922 stood guard on modern battlefields. From Iraq to Afghanistan, from deserts to mountains, the M2 roared on 90 years after its creation. It had outlived every army that carried it. No other weapon in history had served so long, so faithfully. Engineers tried to replace it. They built prototypes with lasers, polymers, advanced mechanisms. All failed the same test. When pushed to the limit, when life depended on a single trigger pull, nothing matched the simplicity of Browning's design. Even computers couldn't outthink the man who had once watched grass move in the wind. And though he never lived to see it, his guns became more than weapons. They became symbols of precision, endurance, and the power of one determined mind. A century later, soldiers still trust his designs. Engines may change, empires may fall, but the roar of Browning's creations still echoes through the world, a reminder that genius never dies. John Moses Browning didn't just build guns. He built legacy in steel, and that legacy still fires.